In 1883, the Smithsonian Institution sent a team to Moundsville, West Virginia. They came for the Grave Creek Mound, one of the largest conical burial mounds in North America. What they found inside changed everything. Skeletons measuring over 7 feet tall, skulls with double rows of teeth, bone structures that didn't match any known human population. The team worked through the night, crating everything they discovered. By dawn, the mound was empty. The artifacts were gone. And the official report, it claimed they found nothing unusual, just standard Native American remains. But the local newspapers told a different story. If you're interested in suppressed history and the mysteries they don't want you questioning, hit subscribe. This channel covers the artifacts, the evidence, and the stories that get erased from the official record. Now let's go back to 1883. Moundsville, West Virginia, sits along the Ohio River, named after the massive earthwork that dominated the landscape for centuries. The Grave Creek Mound stood 69 feet high and 295 feet in diameter at its base. It was impossible to ignore. Local settlers had known about it since the 1770s, but nobody had the resources or authority to excavate it properly until the Smithsonian arrived. The Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology had been surveying mound sites across the eastern United States since 1881. Their official mission was to document Native American burial practices and settle the question of who built these structures. But there was another question lurking beneath the surface. Were all the remains found in these mounds truly Native American? Or was there evidence of something older, something that didn't fit the accepted timeline of human history in North America? When the Smithsonian team opened the Grave Creek Mound, they found a burial chamber 111 feet from the surface. Inside were multiple skeletons arranged in a circular pattern. The team's field notes, which surfaced decades later through Freedom of Information requests, described skeletal remains ranging from 7 to 9 feet in height, femurs measuring 28 inches, skulls with cranial capacities far exceeding modern humans, and dental anomalies, including molars with additional roots and what appeared to be extra rows of teeth. But here's where it gets stranger. The official Smithsonian report published in 1894 made no mention of giant skeletons. It described the remains as typical Adena culture burials dating to roughly 500 BCE. The measurements were listed as average. The anomalies were gone. It was as if two completely different excavations had taken place. Local newspapers didn't stay quiet. The Wheeling Intelligencer ran a story in 1883 titled "Giants of Grave Creek." It quoted workers who helped transport the crates to the train station. They described bones so large they required special reinforced containers. One worker claimed he saw a jawbone that could fit over his entire face. Another described a skeleton that had to be sectioned into 3 parts just to fit in a standard shipping crate. The foreman supervising the loading reportedly asked the Smithsonian team why they needed such heavy-duty transport for what was supposed to be ordinary burial remains. According to the newspaper account, the team leader simply replied that the bones were fragile and required extra protection. But the workers knew what they had seen. These weren't fragile bones, they were massive. The Smithsonian dismissed these accounts as frontier exaggeration, small-town reporters sensationalizing ordinary finds, but the pattern didn't stop at Moundsville. Between 1883 and 1894, the Smithsonian excavated over 1,000 mound sites across West Virginia, Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee. And in dozens of cases, local newspapers reported the same thing. Giant skeletons, unusual bone structure, artifacts that suggested advanced metallurgy and engineering. Then the Smithsonian would arrive, remove everything, and issue reports that contradicted what the locals had witnessed. Take the Creel Mound in South Charleston, West Virginia, excavated in 1883, the same year as Grave Creek. The Charleston Daily Mail reported the discovery of a skeleton measuring 8 feet 4 inches, buried in a sitting position with copper bracelets and a slate tablet covered in unknown script. The article described the copper work as sophisticated, with intricate geometric patterns that suggested advanced metalworking techniques. The slate tablet, according to the reporter who saw it firsthand, contained symbols that didn't match any known Native American writing system. The Smithsonian's official report listed the remains as 6 feet 2 inches and made no mention of the tablet or the copper artifacts. When researchers later requested access to the Creel Mound collection, they were told the materials had been transferred to an off-site storage facility and were unavailable for examination. Or the Mammoth Mound in Moundsville, opened in 1889. Local records describe a central burial chamber containing 11 skeletons, all exceeding 7 feet in height, arranged in a star pattern around a stone altar. The altar itself was described as a single piece of carved granite weighing an estimated 800 pounds, with what appeared to be drainage channels cut into its surface. The positioning of the skeletons was deliberate. Each one faced outward from the center, hands placed on the altar's edge. Whatever ceremony or belief system this represented, it wasn't random. The Smithsonian report, standard Adena burial. No altar mentioned, no unusual measurements, no explanation for how 11 individuals, all exceeding 7 feet, ended up buried together in a precise geometric arrangement. Why the discrepancy? One theory is that the Smithsonian was protecting a specific historical narrative. In the late 1800s, there was a popular belief among certain academic circles that an advanced pre-Columbian civilization had once existed in North America, distinct from Native Americans. This theory was eventually debunked because it was often used to justify the displacement of native tribes. The Smithsonian wanted to kill that racist narrative, and they did. They proved through archaeological evidence that Native American cultures built the mounds, but in the process of debunking the mound builder myth, the Smithsonian may have also buried legitimate evidence of anatomical anomalies that didn't fit either narrative. Because here's the thing. You can prove that Native Americans built the mounds and still acknowledge that some of the remains found inside were unusual. The two aren't mutually exclusive, but the Smithsonian treated them as if they were. Any skeleton that didn't conform to expected parameters was either remeasured, reinterpreted, or removed from the record. And it wasn't just newspaper accounts. Multiple credible sources documented giant remains in West Virginia. Dr. J.P. McLean, a professor at the University of Cincinnati, personally examined skeletons from the Romney Mound in 1887. He published measurements in the American Antiquarian Society Journal describing femurs averaging 26 to 28 inches, which would correspond to individuals between 7 and 8 feet tall. His findings were peer-reviewed and accepted at the time. Today, those skeletons are listed in Smithsonian archives as missing or destroyed. Then there's the case of the Kanawha Valley Mounds, excavated between 1890 and 1892. A team from the Smithsonian worked alongside local historian Ely Moore. Moore kept detailed personal journals which his descendants donated to the West Virginia State Archives in 1974. In those journals, Moore describes multiple skeletons with measurements exceeding 7 feet. He also notes that the Smithsonian team seemed uncomfortable with the findings and spent considerable time remeasuring remains and debating classification standards. At one point, Moore writes that the team leader told him certain measurements would be excluded from the official report because they would create controversy that would overshadow the legitimate scientific work they were doing. Moore interpreted this as academic caution, but reading between the lines it sounds like suppression. So what happened to all those skeletons? According to the Smithsonian's own cataloguing system, thousands of skeletal remains from Appalachian mound sites were transferred to their storage facilities in Washington, D.C. between 1880 and 1900. The transfer manifests still exist. They list crate numbers, excavation sites, and general contents. But when researchers have requested access to these specific collections, they've been told the remains were either lost, damaged in a fire, or returned to tribes for reburial under NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. The problem? NAGPRA wasn't enacted until 1990, so how were remains returned under a law that didn't exist yet? When pressed on this, the Smithsonian's response has been that some remains were informally returned to tribes before NAGPRA made it mandatory. But there's no documentation of these returns, no tribal records confirming receipt, no ceremonial reburials recorded in local newspapers, which would have been significant cultural events worthy of coverage. And if they were lost or destroyed, why is there no documentation of when or how that happened? The Smithsonian is meticulous about cataloguing. They have records of pottery shards and arrowheads from the same excavations. They can tell you which drawer contains a specific clay fragment from a mound excavated in 1887. But the skeletal remains, the most controversial part of the findings, are just gone. In 2008, a researcher named Jim Vieira filed multiple Freedom of Information requests seeking access to records related to giant skeletal remains from Appalachian mounds. After 2 years of delays and partial responses, he received a letter stating that the Smithsonian had no records matching his description. Not that the records were restricted or classified, no records existed. For excavations that were extensively documented in field journals, transfer manifests, and published reports, suddenly there was nothing in the files about unusual skeletal measurements or anomalous remains. Some researchers believe the remains are still there, stored in restricted areas that aren't accessible to the public or even most credentialed academics. Others think they were deliberately destroyed to eliminate evidence that contradicted the preferred historical narrative. Either way, the result is the same. The physical evidence is unavailable for independent verification. Now let's talk about the implications. If the newspaper accounts and field notes are accurate, if there really were multiple skeletons in the 7 to 9 foot range found in West Virginia mounds, what does that mean? It doesn't necessarily prove a lost civilization or a race of giants. There are documented cases of gigantism in human populations, genetic mutations, pituitary disorders, nutritional factors. It's possible that certain isolated groups in ancient Appalachia had higher rates of gigantism than modern populations, but the consistency of the reports is what's striking. We're not talking about 1 or 2 outliers. We're talking about dozens of sites across multiple states, excavated over a 20-year period, all reporting similar findings, and then all of those findings being excluded from official records. That suggests either a coordinated misunderstanding, which seems unlikely, or a coordinated effort to control the narrative. There's also the question of the other artifacts. The copper bracelets, the slate tablets, the worked stone that suggested tool use beyond what was expected for the time period. If those artifacts were real, and if they were associated with the giant skeletons, it would suggest that whoever these individuals were, they had access to resources and technologies that don't align with our current understanding of Adena or Hopewell cultures. But without access to the physical evidence, we can't verify any of it. We're left with newspaper clippings, personal journals, and Freedom of Information Act requests that return heavily redacted documents or flat denials. The Smithsonian's position has remained consistent for over a century. They found no evidence of giant skeletons. The newspaper accounts were exaggerated. The field notes were preliminary observations later corrected through proper analysis. Case closed. Except the case isn't closed for the people in West Virginia who grew up hearing stories from their great-grandparents about the men who loaded those crates onto trains. It's not closed for the researchers who've spent years tracking down primary sources that all point in the same direction. And it's not closed for anyone who thinks that institutions with the power to control historical narratives should be transparent about what they find and why they choose to publicize some discoveries while burying others. The Grave Creek Mound still stands in Moundsville today. It's a state park now. You can visit it, walk around it, read the plaques that describe it as an Adena burial site from 250 to 150 BCE. The plaques mention the Smithsonian excavation. They say it confirmed the mound was built by Native Americans as a burial chamber for their leaders. They don't mention the 7-foot skeletons. They don't mention the double rows of teeth. And they definitely don't mention the crates that left in the middle of the night, because that version of the story doesn't fit the official record. And in the end, the official record is what gets carved into stone and taught in schools and accepted as fact. Everything else becomes folklore, becomes conspiracy theory, becomes the kind of thing people dismiss without investigation because it sounds too strange to be true. But sometimes the stranger stories are the ones worth investigating. Not because they prove something extraordinary, but because the effort to suppress them raises questions about what else we're not being told, about what other artifacts are sitting in storage facilities labelled as lost or destroyed, about what other field notes were quietly edited before publication, about what other discoveries were deemed too controversial to share with the public. The giant skeletons of West Virginia might have been exactly what the newspapers claimed, or they might have been misidentified, exaggerated, or misunderstood. But we'll never know for certain as long as the evidence remains locked away or erased from the record. And that's the real story here. Not whether giants once walked the hills of Appalachia, but whether the institutions we trust to preserve history are actually preserving all of it, or just the parts that fit the narrative they want us to believe. That's it for this one. If you want more suppressed history and archaeological controversies, the algorithm thinks you'll like the video on screen. And if you made it this far, subscribe so you don't miss the next investigation.